You moved to the country. The country was already occupied. There's a particular kind of wildlife conflict story that wildlife rehabilitators, rural landowners, and conservation professionals have started to recognize on site. It goes like this. Someone moves to a rural area, discovers that rural areas contain wildlife, and then spends considerable energy trying to make the wildlife go somewhere else. The raccoons were here first. So were the possums, the coyotes, the feral hogs, the barn owls, and the snake you found in your garden that you posted about in a panic on Facebook. They were all here before the fence posts, before the patio, before the outdoor cat feeding station you set up with the best intentions. This is not a criticism. It is an orientation. Because the first step toward actually coexisting with wildlife is understanding that you moved into their neighborhood, and that comes with some responsibilities that a Google search and a marshmallow trap are not going to fulfill. The amenity migration problem. Researchers have a name for what happens when people relocate to rural areas specifically for the lifestyle, the land, the quiet, and the aesthetics of nature. They call it amenity migration, and studies show it leads to habitat fragmentation, increased invasive species pressure, and altered wildlife migration patterns that significantly impact local biodiversity. In other words, the very people drawn to rural areas because they love nature often bring the most disruptive expectations about what nature is supposed to look like and how it's supposed to behave. Researchers have documented ecological and landscape transformations that reflect the conflicting nature ideologies of newcomers and established populations. Long-term rural residents tend to understand that wildlife is part of the deal. Newcomers, arriving with an idea of nature built from aesthetics rather than experience, often do not. The raccoon on your porch is not a malfunction. It is Tuesday. The feeding station pipeline. Here's where things get ecologically interesting and where good intentions start producing measurable harm. Outdoor cat feeding is widespread, especially among people who care about animals. The impulse is understandable. Feral cats are often in rough shape, and leaving food out feels like the compassionate thing to do. What it actually does is create a wildlife buffet with no bouncer. Research on feral cat feeding stations found that wildlife consumed the overwhelming majority of the food. At one monitored station, raccoons accounted for 15% of feeder visits, with skunks dominating at 74%, and the target species, feral cats, making up only 4% of visits. The cats were frequently arriving to an empty bowl. Cat colonies form around food sources and grow to the limits of the food supply. So do raccoon populations. So do skunk populations. So does every other opportunistic omnivore in the coastal plains of South Texas, which is, as it turns out, most of them. If you've been putting food out for months and now have what feels like a raccoon convention on your property, the food is not incidental to that situation. The food is the situation. The feral cat piece nobody wants to talk about. Feral cat management is genuinely complicated, and this is not an attack on people who care about cats. I care about cats. But the ecological reality is difficult to ignore. Scientists from the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated that free-ranging domestic cats kill between 1.3 and 4.0 billion birds and between 6.3 and 22.3 billion small mammals annually in the United States. In the coastal plains of South Texas, which sits directly in major migratory flyways and hosts significant populations of ground-nesting shorebirds and grassland species, that number is not abstract. It is local. It is the killdeer nesting at the edge of your pasture and the meadowlarks in the field behind your house. Feral and free-ranging cats compete directly with native mesopredators like skunks, opossums, raccoons, and foxes for prey. Humans subsidize cat populations by supplying food and shelter, allowing cat populations to reach densities up to 100 times higher than those of their native counterparts. You cannot feed one part of this system and be surprised when the rest of it shows up at the table. The I did my research problem. Nature is not a catalog. You don't get to choose the animals that you will see and won't see in your yard. That is a direct quote from wildlife professional Ed Clark, and it is worth posting somewhere you will read it regularly. Rural wildlife literacy is not built through internet searches. It is built through years of observation, hands-on experience, and the humility to consult people who actually work with these animals. Licensed wildlife rehabilitators, TPWD, local wildlife control operators who know the species, the season, and the legal landscape. Research shows that individual attitudes and beliefs toward wildlife strongly predict support for lethal or removal-based control measures over non-lethal strategies like deterrence and education. People who arrive with a fear of or frustration with wildlife are more likely to reach for a trap than a conversation with someone who knows what they're doing. The internet will confirm whatever you want it to confirm. That is not the same as accurate information. What rural coexistence actually looks like. People who have lived rural lives for a long time are not naive about wildlife. They know raccoons are destructive. They know coyotes will take chickens. They know snakes are going to be in the garden. They manage these realities through deterrence, habitat modification, secured food sources, and occasionally licensed professional intervention when something genuinely crosses a line. They do not tend to be shocked that the country has animals in it. More than 90% of human-wildlife conflicts can be resolved on-site without removing the animal. Secure your food sources. Bring cat bowls in at night. Use motion-activated deterrence. Accept that some amount of wildlife presence is not a problem to be solved. It is the baseline. If you move to the country because you love nature, the most important thing you can do for that nature is learn to share it with something other than your own comfort level. The raccoons were here first. They will be here after you. The least you can do is not make their remaining time a death sentence in a borrowed live trap on the way to a county park. For questions about wildlife conflicts in Texas, contact TPWD at 1-800-792-1112. For wildlife emergencies in the Gulf Coast region, contact Gulf Coast Wildlife Rescue. To find a licensed wildlife rehabilitator near you, visit the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association directory. If this feels like a call-out article, that's because it is. Make sure to read my previous article linked below.